The train wound through the hills like a silver thread under the dying Sunday. From the window, I watched the landscape of my childhood unfold: golden fields, crooked fences, the slow dance of wind through the pines. After 20 years abroad, I was coming home to the village I once thought I'd left behind forever. The air smelled of earth and smoke, the same scent that used to cling to my mother's apron. I pressed my hand against the glass, half expecting the world to vanish like a dream. It didn't. It waited. The platform was almost empty when I stepped off, my old suitcase bumping against my leg. People stared. A woman past 50, dressed simply, her face marked by years but her eyes still sharp. I walked through the familiar dirt road, passing cottages with sagging roofs and sunflowers drooping in the twilight. The house I bought stood at the end of the lane, small but strong, like the kind of life I wanted now: quiet, unassuming, forgotten by the world. I had only been there a week when the phone rang. Ethan's voice filled the kitchen, warm and hurried as always. "Mom, I have news. Big news." I smiled, picturing his boyish grin, though he was 30 now and far away from the child who once ran barefoot through these same roads. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I'm bringing someone home," he said. "Her name's Clara. My fiancée." The word landed like a pebble in still water. "Fiancée?" I repeated softly. "Already?" He laughed. "You'll love her, Mom. She's beautiful, smart, from a good family. You'll see." From a good family. The words echoed with a sting I tried to ignore. "When are you coming?" I asked. "Next weekend." "I'll be ready," I said, though my hands trembled slightly as I hung up. I looked around my small kitchen, the peeling paint, the clay pots, the scent of herbs drying by the window. It was all part of the life I had built carefully, piece by piece, a life without the shadows of the past. But as I stood there listening to the ticking clock, something inside me whispered that peace never lasts long, not for women like me. I wasn't always the woman who boiled tea on a wood stove and mended her own curtains. There was a time when I wore silk instead of cotton and held meetings in glass offices overlooking the city skyline. Back then, people called me Mrs. Valencia with a kind of respect that always came mixed with envy. I owned a small chain of design boutiques, my husband ran his family's construction firm, and our son Ethan studied at a private academy. We were what others called successful, but behind the polished surface, our marriage was a slow, elegant collapse. My husband's family never forgave me for being a farmer's daughter. They thought I was decoration, something pretty he'd get bored of once he had an heir. I proved them wrong for years, until the day I discovered his betrayal. It wasn't the affair that broke me. It was the revelation that his mother had orchestrated it, to push me out and keep their fortune in the bloodline. I remember the day I left. The house smelled of roses and deceit. I packed one suitcase, left the keys on the table, and vanished. No one came after me. I crossed the ocean, started again under another name, and never spoke of it. For 20 years, I lived quietly, working in small shops, reading by lamplight, raising Ethan from afar through phone calls and letters. When he grew independent, I came back here to the village where my story had begun, pretending to be nothing more than a simple widow with calloused hands and too many memories. People believed it easily. They always do when you don't fit their idea of importance. But when Ethan called about Clara, something inside me stirred an old caution, a shadow from the life I buried. I had seen too many smiles that hid knives, so I made a quiet decision that night, as the wind rattled the shutters. When they arrived, I wouldn't meet Clara as the educated woman I once was. I would meet her as the world's favorite fool, the uneducated village mother. Let her show me who she really is when she thinks I am beneath her. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed listening to the crickets outside, my mind wandering through the ruins of old memories. I could still hear my late mother-in-law's voice, sharp and perfumed with disdain. "You can dress a peasant in pearls, but she'll still smell of dirt." I had been so naive back then, thinking education and success could wash away the stain of being from the countryside. They had looked at me the way one looks at a well-trained pet, amused, but never equal. I swore I would never beg for anyone's approval again. Now, decades later, the past had found its way back through my son's voice and the woman he was bringing home. I didn't know Clara yet, but the way Ethan spoke of her family, her father's business, her elegant mother, their summer house by the coast made my chest tighten. I recognized the pattern. Wealth, class, The kind of people who believe money grants them better manners and better souls. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and stood by the window, the moonlight turning the glass pale. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe instinct sharpened by years of humiliation, but I felt something cold stir inside me. I wouldn't let history repeat itself. If Clara loved my son truly, it wouldn't matter who I was or what I looked like, and if she didn't, I needed to know before it was too late. So I made a decision. When they arrived, I wouldn't be the woman who once spoke at business conferences or dined with investors. I would be the woman my husband's family once mocked the uneducated Marta from the village. I would wear my simplest dress, braid my gray hair, and speak softly, as if unsure of my own words. I would let her see what she wanted to see, a harmless old woman with rough hands and little understanding of the world. Let her arrogance walk right into the trap of her own making. I smiled faintly at the thought. Life has a cruel sense of humor. Sometimes, to find the truth, you have to become the lie people believe. They arrived on a bright Saturday morning, the kind of day when the air hums with cicadas and everything smells of sunlight. I stood by the gate with a basket of apples in my hands, pretending to wipe them on my apron. The car rolled up the dirt road, shining like something from another planet. Ethan jumped out first, taller than I remembered, his face alight with excitement. "Mom!" he shouted, and for a moment all my defenses melted. I hugged him tightly, feeling the solid warmth of my only child, the one person who never owed me anything but love. Then she stepped out. Clara. She was beautiful effortlessly, so the kind of beauty that knows it's being watched. Her dress was too crisp for the dust of the countryside, her perfume too heavy for the wind. She smiled, revealing perfect teeth, and reached out her manicured hand. "Mrs. Valencia, it's such an honor to finally meet you," she said sweetly. I let out a small laugh and corrected her softly. "Just Marta, dear. I'm no one's missus anymore." Her smile flickered, just for a heartbeat, then returned brighter, tighter. Ethan beamed. "Isn't she lovely, Mom?" "Lovely indeed," I said, studying her eyes. They were the kind that smiled only at the surface. Over lunch, she complimented everything, the food, the furniture, even the air, yet her tone carried the faint condescension of someone slumming politely through another world. When I told her I'd made the bread myself, she blinked. "Oh, you bake? That's so quaint." Ethan didn't notice. He was too busy admiring her, too blind to the small knife hidden behind every word. I smiled, played my part, poured her more lemonade. But inside, I felt that old instinct rising again, the one that warned me when danger wore silk gloves. Clara was charming, yes. But beneath the sweetness, I sensed something metallic, sharp, and cold, and I knew, as sure as the evening sun, that my little game had only just begun. The first evening of their visit felt heavy, even before the candles were lit. The house smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, the way it always did when I cooked, though now I could see Clara's delicate nose twitch at every wisp of scent. I had spent the afternoon preparing everything myself: braised lamb, roasted vegetables, a pie that had taken hours, but when I set the table, I caught the faintest sigh escape her lips. "Oh, it's lovely," she said, smiling that tight smile again, the one that didn't quite touch her eyes. Ethan, oblivious, raised his glass. "To family," he said cheerfully. Clara's laugh was light as sugar, but her hand lingered around her wine instead of drinking. "Of course, to family," she echoed softly. Through the meal, she asked polite questions, complimented the rustic charm of the house, and made a show of tasting everything as if it were an exotic experience. I smiled, answering simply, letting her think my world was small and harmless. After dinner, I left them in the sitting room while I cleaned the kitchen. The old walls carried sound well, and from where I stood by the sink, I could hear their voices muffled but clear enough. "Ethan," she said, lowering her tone, "I adore your mother truly, but that smell, the smoke, the herbs, it's so strong, it clings to everything." Ethan chuckled softly. "That's just the wood stove, darling. She likes it that way." "Yes, but it's old-fashioned. And her clothes, that apron, it's like something out of a folk tale. I just wish she'd try a little harder. She seems simple." I froze, my hands still wet. Simple. The word pricked something deep inside me. Ethan said nothing, only sighed as if choosing peace over truth. "She's not used to guests, Clara. She's from another world." "Exactly," Clara murmured, her voice silk over steel. Another world. I turned off the tap, breathing quietly through the weight pressing against my chest. I could have walked in and confronted her, stripped the silk from her tongue with a few choice words, but I didn't. I dried my hands slowly, straightened my back, and smiled to myself in the empty kitchen. Let her think I was a fool. It's always easier to reveal a person's soul when they believe no one's watching. The next morning, the house was filled with soft sunlight and the faint crackle of frying eggs. I hummed to myself as I worked, letting Clara sleep late. When she finally appeared, perfectly groomed and glowing, she looked around the kitchen like she had entered a museum exhibit. "You're up early," I said, smiling warmly. "City people usually love their sleep." She laughed lightly, tucking her hair behind one ear. "Oh, I just can't sleep in strange places. It's charming here, though. Very authentic." I offered her tea, served in mismatched cups, and asked the kind of questions that made me sound curious but harmless. "And your family, dear? What do they do?" Her eyes brightened. "My father runs a consulting firm. My mother does charity work, mostly abroad. We travel a lot. We have a house in Geneva, a place in Maine." She trailed off deliberately, watching me over the rim of her cup. I nodded, pretending to be impressed. "How wonderful. So much world to see. I've only ever seen the next village," I said softly, folding my hands like a woman in awe. "Oh," she said with a sympathetic smile, "that's sweet. You must find it peaceful here. I wouldn't know what to do without the noise of the city." I laughed as if she'd told a joke. "We have our kind of noise too. The roosters don't sleep in." She smiled politely, but her eyes were already drifting elsewhere. Bored. Over lunch, I asked her if she liked the countryside. "It's fine for a weekend," she said, "but I could never live here. I need culture." "We have culture," I said with mock innocence. "Last summer, the choir sang in front of the town hall. Everyone brought pies." She laughed too loud, mistaking simplicity for stupidity. "That's adorable." Ethan reached for her hand, and I caught the faint gleam of pride in her eyes, as if she'd conquered some invisible battlefield. I watched her closely, storing every gesture, every glance, every word. Let her think she was superior, let her underestimate me. The more she spoke, the clearer she became. Some truths reveal themselves best in the company of fools, and I was playing mine beautifully. By the third day, I knew exactly what I needed to do. It was a quiet afternoon, sunlight spilling through the lace curtains, catching the dust like golden threads in the air. Clara sat in the garden under the old walnut tree, scrolling through her phone, a small frown creasing her perfect brow as if the world had failed to entertain her enough. I came outside carrying a small wooden box. Inside it lay a bracelet I had made years ago, rough silver wire twisted with tiny glass beads, the colors of dawn and river stones. It wasn't valuable, not in any worldly sense, but it held a story, my mother's hands teaching me how to bend metal with patience, the same hands that had once patched every tear in my childhood. I offered it to her with a quiet smile. "Clara, I made this a long time ago. I'd love for you to have it, a little welcome gift." She looked up, momentarily startled, then smiled politely, the way one might at a child's drawing. "Oh, you didn't have to," she said, taking the box with careful fingers. She lifted the bracelet, examined it for a second, and her lips curved not in gratitude but amusement. "It's sweet," she said, her voice feather, light but sharp beneath. "Very rustic." Ethan, who was watering the flowers nearby, chuckled. "Mom used to make these all the time when I was a kid. She's quite good." Clara tilted her head. "Of course, it's charming in a handmade sort of way. You know, I'm allergic to certain metals, though. My skin's very sensitive." She placed it delicately back into the box, as if the mere touch had dirtied her. "Maybe I'll keep it as a keepsake," she added, smiling thinly. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "As you wish, dear. It's only a little thing." But inside, something wilted. Not because of her words, those I expected, but because of Ethan's silence. He didn't see her sneer, or didn't want to. I excused myself, went back to the kitchen, and sat down by the window. The bracelet had never been meant to test her wealth. It was meant to test her heart, and she'd failed without even knowing it. Outside, I could hear her laugh float through the garden, bright, cold, and hollow, like glass breaking in the Sunday. The next morning, I went to the market in town. The square buzzed with the usual rhythm of life, the scent of baked bread, children chasing each other near the fountain, the gossiping hum of familiar voices. I'd almost forgotten how quickly word travels in a small place. I was selecting peaches when someone called my name. Marta Valencia, I thought that was you. It was Marla, my neighbor from 2 houses down, a kind woman with more curiosity than discretion. She leaned closer, lowering her voice the way people do when they're about to share something heavy. You know that pretty city girl staying with you? I saw her yesterday. Clara? I asked lightly, though my chest tightened. Yes, her. She was in town with your boy. Such a picture, the two of them. But later I saw her alone by the bakery talking on her phone. Loudly, dear. Said something about how she'll finally marry into money and never have to step foot in this dump again. My stomach turned cold. Are you sure she said that? As sure as I'm standing here, Marla whispered, and when old Mr. Fisher tried to give her directions to the post office, she just waved him off like a maid. Poor man looked ready to sink into the ground. I thanked her quietly and paid for my fruit, forcing my hands not to tremble. On the walk home, the countryside seemed to shift around me, the fields too bright, the road too long. Each step echoed with a single thought. I had been right to test her. This girl didn't see love in Ethan, she saw a ladder. When I reached the gate, I could hear their laughter from inside. Clara's lilting, artificial, Ethan's sincere and trusting. I stood there a moment, unseen, listening to my son's joy, knowing it was built on a lie. I wanted to run to him, to warn him. But instead, I straightened my shoulders, adjusted my shawl, and whispered to myself, not yet. The truth, like fruit, needs to ripen before it's picked. And when it is, it falls hard. It happened in the late afternoon, when the sun was leaning low and the air had that soft, sleepy warmth of summer's end. I was pruning the rose bushes by the fence when I heard a sudden sharp voice cut through the stillness. Get away, filthy thing! Clara's tone was so loud, so raw, that even the birds in the walnut tree scattered. I turned, startled, and saw her standing near the porch steps, one hand clutching her dress, the other holding a watering can as if it were a weapon. At her feet was a small dog, thin, muddy ribs showing through its matted fur tail, wagging hesitantly, one of the strays that wandered in from the edge of the fields. Don't you dare touch me! She hissed at the animal, kicking dirt toward it. The poor creature whimpered, backing away but still trying to wag its tail, desperate for kindness. Go, get out! Her voice cracked with disgust, as though she were shouting at a disease. I froze where I stood, pruning shears still in my hand, unable to move. There was something in her eyes, a flash of coldness, so absolute it made my skin prickle. It wasn't fear, it was contempt. When she noticed me watching, she straightened, forcing a laugh. Oh, Mrs. Marta, it just startled me. I'm not really a dog person. They're unpredictable, you know. Her smile was too quick, too sweet. Of course, I said softly, though my voice sounded distant to my own ears. I knelt beside the trembling dog, coaxing it closer with a whisper. It sniffed my hand, then leaned into my touch with the trust only animals can give. Poor thing, I murmured. Clara shifted uncomfortably. I hope it doesn't have fleas. I looked up at her, and for a brief moment our gazes locked. Hers was the look of someone who sees no difference between a stray animal and a person beneath her. He just wanted a bit of water, I said, turning away. The dog drank gratefully from the dish I placed down, tail wagging again. Clara sighed, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. I suppose country people are used to this sort of thing. I smiled faintly. Yes, I said, we are. But inside, I felt something sharp twist. That wasn't fear I'd seen in her eyes. It was who she truly was, and I had just witnessed it unmasked and unashamed. That evening, when Clara went to shower before dinner, I found Ethan on the porch, scrolling through his phone, the glow of the screen softening his face. For a long moment, I just watched him, my boy, my only child, grown into a man but still carrying the same innocence that had once made him believe monsters only existed in stories. Ethan, I said gently, sitting beside him. Can we talk? He smiled without looking up. Sure, Mom. What's up? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I saw Clara today. She wasn't kind to a stray dog that wandered in. I think maybe she... He cut me off with a small laugh. Oh, that? She told me. Mom, she's terrified of dogs. You know how city girls are. Terrified, I repeated softly. That's not what it looked like. Mom, he interrupted again, sighing. You've got to stop looking for problems where there aren't any. Clara's just different from the people around here. You can't expect her to act like a villager. I looked at him then, really looked. His tone was protective, almost defensive. He'd built a wall around her already, and I was on the outside. I'm not asking her to be anyone else, I said quietly. I just want to be sure she's the right person for you. He turned to me with a faint frown. She is. You just don't understand her. You've lived out here so long, you've forgotten what the real world is like. The word struck deeper than he knew. The real world. The one I had left behind, the one that had already burned me once. I forced a smile, though it trembled. Maybe you're right, I whispered. Maybe I've forgotten. He softened, leaning over to kiss my forehead. I know you mean well, Mom. But please give her a chance. She makes me happy. He went back inside, humming softly. I sat there alone, the night pressing close around me, listening to the faint laughter drifting from the kitchen. Happiness built on blindness is fragile, it breaks with the first truth. And I knew that sooner or later, Ethan would see what I saw. But by then, it might already be too late. The days that followed carried a strange stillness, like the air before a summer storm. Clara had grown more comfortable, drifting through my home as though it already belonged to her, opening cupboards without asking, correcting the way I folded napkins, humming some city tune while I cooked. I let her. A fool's confidence is the easiest mask to wear. One evening, I couldn't sleep. The clock on the wall marked each second too loudly, and the night outside was restless with wind. I got up to make tea, moving quietly so as not to wake them. But as I passed the guest room, I stopped. Clara's voice floated through the half-closed door low, hurried, dripping with irritation. No, listen, she was saying, her tone sharp, stripped of the sweetness she used in daylight. Once we get his inheritance, I'll finally get what I deserve. You said it yourself, I've waited long enough. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was a pause, the faint sound of a man's voice on the other end muffled, but unmistakably intimate. Clara laughed softly. He's too naive. The mother, completely harmless, sweet but clueless. She still thinks I'm some innocent little angel. My stomach tightened. Just a few more months, she whispered. Then, everything changes. The mattress creaked as she shifted, and I stepped back, silent, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't hear the rest. I didn't need to. Her voice had carried enough poison to make the meaning clear. I returned to my room, the teapot forgotten on the counter, my hands trembling as I shut the door. For a long time, I stood by the window watching the dark fields sway under the moonlight. My son's laughter, his dreams, his love, all tangled in the web of this woman's deceit. I wanted to storm into her room, rip the truth from her mouth, but I didn't. Instead, I sat down on the edge of my bed, whispering to the shadows, "Patience, Marta. You've waded through worse storms than this." In my chest, the ache turned into something sharper, colder, not grief, not fear, but resolve. The next morning, Clara acted as though nothing had happened. She wore a floral dress, her hair pinned perfectly, her voice syrup-sweet as she chatted with Ethan over breakfast. I watched her laugh, stirring her coffee, the same hand that had held the phone hours ago. Every movement was practiced, every smile rehearsed. When they went out for a walk, I finally acted. I called Rosa, an old friend from the city, a woman who once worked beside me during the years when I still had power and name. She owed me nothing, but I knew I could trust her. "Rosa," I said softly, my voice trembling despite myself. "I need your help." There was silence on the line for a moment, then her warm, steady tone. "You sound like the Marta I remember, the one who never asked for favors unless she was bleeding inside. What's wrong?" I hesitated, then told her everything. Not all of it, not the part where my son's heart was on the line, but enough for her to understand. Clara's name, her supposed family background, the way she spoke of her parents' wealth. Rosa listened carefully. "Give me a few days," she said. "I'll find out who she really is." When I hung up, my reflection in the kitchen window looked older, sterner, almost unfamiliar. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me, a woman who had buried her true self for years, now quietly digging her power back up from the dirt. That night, I set Clara's place at the table as usual, smiled when she complimented the stew, and nodded when Ethan spoke of future plans, a house in the city, a family, a life together. I said nothing, only listened. But inside, I counted the hours until Rosa would call. Truth takes time to surface, but once it does, it drowns everything built on lies. And I was ready to watch them sink. The festival came every year, the kind of simple celebration that made the whole town glow with laughter and lantern light. Children ran with ribbons in their hair, old men tuned their accordions, and women baked pies big enough to feed half the county. It was a world far too small for someone like Clara, though Ethan insisted she would love the local charm. She arrived in a white dress far too fine for the dust and heat, her jewelry glittering against the sunlight. People turned to look, not out of admiration, but curiosity. She was something foreign here, too polished to belong. I stood beside her at the pie stall, greeting neighbors with the soft dialect of my childhood, the one I'd hidden for years when I lived among the wealthy. It slipped from my tongue easily, warm as bread from the oven. "You talk funny," Clara said suddenly, loud enough for those around us to hear. Her laughter rang like glass breaking. "You stretch your vowels so much. It's almost theatrical." She mimicked me then, exaggerating my words, drawing laughs from a few bystanders who didn't know whether to smile or look away. My cheeks burned not from shame but restraint. Ethan frowned, touching her arm. "Clara, stop," he murmured. She giggled, brushing him off. "Oh, come on, it's adorable. She sounds like those peasant women in old movies." The laughter around us faded into an uneasy silence. I forced a small smile and said nothing. The mask must stay on. A fool never defends her pride, that's how she learns what others truly think. I turned to the vendor and calmly bought 2 slices of pie, handing one to Clara as if her words had been nothing more than air. "You should try this," I said gently. "It's made with apples from my garden." She hesitated, then took a bite, her smirk returning. "Sweet," she said. "Just like you, Marta." I nodded, though my heart felt like stone. Later that night, when the lanterns dimmed and the music faded, I stood outside under the stars, my apron still dusted with flour. Let her think she'd won a little battle. I had survived worse humiliations than a spoiled girl's laughter. I'd survived entire wars of pride and deceit, and I was still standing. 2 mornings later, I found the envelope in the mailbox, plain, white, unmarked, except for my name written in Rosa's precise handwriting. My heart tightened as I carried it inside. The kettle was whistling, the house still half asleep, but the moment I broke the seal, the rest of the world vanished. Rosa's words were brief, factual, sharp as a blade. Clara Beaumont. Her father's company declared bankruptcy 5 years ago. Multiple outstanding debts. Her mother sells designer replicas online. Clara herself has no assets in her name, only credit cards nearly maxed out. She's been living off relationships, 2 short engagements, both broken, when the families discovered her financial situation. I read it twice, then set it down on the table beside my untouched tea. The steam curled into the air and disappeared, just like the illusion Clara had spun. So that was her wealth, smoke, and stories. The good family she bragged about was built on borrowed silk and unpaid bills. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the paper. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was something colder, confirmation. The kind of truth that leaves no room for doubt. When Ethan came down for breakfast, I greeted him with a smile, hiding the letter beneath an old cookbook. Clara followed soon after, radiant as always, talking about their plans to visit the coast, her laughter filling the kitchen like perfume too sweet to breathe. I poured her tea, my hands steady again. "You seem happy today," she said brightly. "I am," I replied, meeting her eyes. "I finally see things clearly." She tilted her head, puzzled, but smiled. "That's good. Clarity is important at your age." Her condescension rolled off me like rain on glass. I smiled again, thinking of Rosa's final line in the letter, "Be careful." Women like her don't love people, they love opportunities. I stirred my tea slowly, watching the sugar dissolve. Yes, I murmured to myself, clarity is everything. The morning after I read Rosa's letter, I packed a small bag and told Ethan I needed to visit an old friend in the next town. He didn't question it. Clara, preoccupied with choosing a dress for her upcoming engagement party, barely looked up from her phone. The city was 2 hours away by train, its skyline rising like a promise and a threat all at once. I hadn't set foot there in years, not since I'd left behind the woman who once owned offices instead of gardens. But that version of me had her uses. I tied my hair into a neat bun, put on glasses, and wore a plain navy suit, the kind of anonymity that lets people look through you rather than at you. Rosa's note had mentioned the name of Clara's last workplace: Fulton and Myers Finance. I walked into their glass building with a calm confidence that came from memory. The receptionist, a young man with tired eyes, barely glanced up when I approached. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "I'm from the audit team reviewing employee terminations. I need to verify records for a Miss Clara Beaumont." The name landed like a coin dropped into a well, quiet, but with weight. He frowned, tapped his keyboard, and muttered, "Oh, her." I leaned closer. "Trouble?" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, she was fired 3 months ago." Embezzlement. Nothing official, of course. They kept it quiet, didn't want the firm's name dragged through the mud. But everyone knows. She siphoned client bonuses into her own account. I let a slow, deliberate breath escape, feigning mild surprise. "I see. Thank you for your time." "Crazy story," he said, shaking his head. "She acted like royalty, but it turns out she couldn't even manage her own debts." I smiled faintly, then walked out, the heels of my shoes echoing down the marble floor. Outside, the city buzzed with noise and light, yet it all felt far away. The truth had a bitter taste, not because it shocked me, but because it didn't. I had seen this kind of woman before, the kind who mistook manipulation for charm. On the train back home, I stared at my reflection in the window and whispered, "So that's who you are, Clara, a liar wrapped in silk." The countryside blurred past, green and endless. My silence on the ride home wasn't defeat, it was strategy. When Clara's parents arrived for the engagement party, the air in the house seemed to change heavier, perfumed with money and arrogance. They stepped out of a sleek black car, their smiles already polished for display. Her mother, Veronica, wore pearls large enough to make a bishop jealous. Her father, Edward, carried the posture of a man who'd spent his life pretending to be richer than he was. "Mrs. Marta!" Veronica exclaimed, kissing the air near my cheek. How delightful to finally meet Ethan's mother. The pause before the word didn't go unnoticed. "And what a charming little home you have. So traditional." "It keeps me grounded," I said, smiling faintly. "Would you like some tea?" "Oh yes, but only if it's herbal," she replied quickly, glancing around the living room as if afraid of catching dust. Edward had already found Ethan, clapping him on the shoulder with forced warmth. "So this is where you grew up, son. Very quaint. Reminds me of our gardener's cottage." They laughed together, a duet of superiority. Clara joined in, the sound bright but brittle. I watched her closely. She avoided my eyes now more than before, like someone afraid of mirrors. Over dinner, they praised Ethan's career, spoke endlessly about their connections, and corrected my pronunciation of certain words as if they were teachers and I their student. I listened, nodding politely, serving them food I knew they found too simple. When I mentioned the festival, Veronica smiled thinly. "Oh yes, Clara told us about that. How adorable. You really keep the old traditions alive, don't you?" "Traditions keep the heart alive," I replied. "Without them, people forget who they are," Edward chuckled. "Well, some of us prefer to forget humble beginnings." I smiled as I poured his wine, my hand perfectly steady. "Yes," I said softly. "I can see that," Clara's laughter faltered. For a second, her mask slipped, and I caught a flicker of unease in her eyes. I didn't press further. "Not yet. Let them enjoy their little feast of pride and self-importance. The night would come soon enough when they'd choke on the truth." The morning after the engagement party, I woke early, long before the others stirred. The house was still, holding the stale scent of last night's wine and too many false smiles. I moved quietly through the living room, gathering glasses, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Clara had grown bolder, her voice carried over Ethan's now, her laughter sharper, her eyes colder. Every word she spoke seemed rehearsed, crafted to make my son smaller, more dependent. She knew how to play the gentle fiancée, but when she thought no one watched, her mask cracked. And I had watched long enough. That afternoon, when they left to visit a jeweler in town, I went into their room. I stood there for a long moment, my heart thudding steadily, then slipped a small digital recorder, one I'd used years ago for meetings, under the dresser near the window. I left the device running, its red light blinking faintly like a heartbeat. I didn't feel guilty. I felt cautious. Experience had taught me that truth rarely speaks aloud when it knows it's being heard. That evening, I retrieved it after they returned and went to bed. I waited until the house was silent, then sat at the kitchen table, the recorder cold in my palm. I pressed play. At first, it was nothing but faint chatter, Clara humming to herself, the sound of fabric rustling. Then her voice shifted, her tone low and unfamiliar. "He's too easy, really," she said. A pause. "He thinks I care about his plans, his little dreams. But he's just a step toward my real goal." My breath caught. A man's voice, unfamiliar, distant, answered, "And that goal is?" Clara laughed, soft and venomous. "Security, the kind that lasts. Once we're married, the inheritance is inevitable. After that, who knows? Maybe I'll finally live the life I deserve." Silence followed, broken only by the faint sound of Ethan's voice calling her name from another room. "Coming!" She sang back sweetly, her tone transforming in an instant. I stopped the recording, staring into the dark window where my reflection looked older, colder, harder. There it was, the confession wrapped in casual cruelty. I thought of Ethan, his trust so pure it blinded him, and of my husband's family, who once believed I wasn't good enough for their son. I smiled faintly, bitterly. I wonder what they would think now. I deleted nothing. I simply rewound the tape and let her voice play once more. Not for revenge, for remembrance. 2 days later, while cleaning the attic, I found a box I hadn't opened in years, dusty, worn, labeled with a single word, past. I didn't know what drew me to it, only that something inside whispered, "Look." The air was thick with dust as I pried it open. Old papers, yellowed letters, and a handful of photographs lay inside. I sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, flipping through the memories one by one. My wedding day, Ethan's first birthday, business dinners with faces long forgotten. Then, at the bottom, a picture that made my fingers freeze. It was taken decades ago, in front of a seaside hotel. My husband, Leonard, stood there young, handsome, confident. Beside him, laughing with her hand on his arm, was a woman I didn't recognize at first. Her smile was striking, her beauty deliberate, the kind that leaves an impression even in black and white. And then I saw it, the eyes, the same pale gray eyes as Clara's. My breath hitched. On the back of the photograph, in Leonard's familiar handwriting, was scrawled, "Summer Gala, 1995 Veronica Beaumont." I sat there, the name burning into me like a wound reopening. Clara's mother, of course! The resemblance was undeniable, the same tilt of the chin, the same practiced smile that knew the weight of manipulation. My husband had known her long before I entered his life. And suddenly, the pieces began to shift in my mind, forming something darker. Was it coincidence that Clara had found Ethan? Or had Veronica's daughter come looking for us deliberately, continuing some old unfinished game? I pressed the photograph to my chest, feeling my pulse hammer beneath it. Downstairs, I heard Clara's laughter float through the open window, light and silvery as poison. My husband's ghost seemed to whisper in the dust around me. "The sins of the past never stay buried, Marta." I looked again at the faces in the photo, his charm, her knowing smile, and I understood. This wasn't just deceit. This was inheritance, not of wealth, but of vengeance. And now it was at my doorstep, wearing white and calling me Mother. The photograph haunted me for days. Every time Clara smiled, I saw her mother's face behind it, the same tilt of the head, the same calculated warmth. But I needed more than suspicion. I needed truth. So I did what I always did when I wanted answers. I called Rosa. She didn't ask questions, just promised to dig deeper. The next evening her message came through, short and devastating. "Marta, it's worse than we thought. Veronica Beaumont, maiden name Veronica Hale, worked as a marketing consultant in your husband's firm 25 years ago. There were rumors back then about her and Leonard. Quiet ones, but persistent. A few employees even confirmed that he paid off her debts right before she resigned. I think she's the same woman." My hands shook as I read it, the words blurred. I closed my eyes and the memory came flooding back. Leonard's unexplained late nights, the sudden gifts, the expensive necklace I found that wasn't mine. When I asked him about it, he said, "For a client." I had believed him because love blinds us until it burns. And now, all these years later, the daughter of that same woman was sitting at my table, plotting to take from my son what her mother couldn't steal from me. A revenge that had ripened over decades. A generational hatred dressed in perfume and pearls. I understood now the way Clara's eyes had lingered on my home, the way she flinched whenever I mentioned Leonard. She had known exactly who I was all along. It wasn't coincidence that she found Ethan. It was legacy. That night, I stood by my window, staring at the moon hanging low over the fields. The wind whispered through the tall grass like an old song, and I finally spoke into the darkness. "So, this is what you left me, Leonard. A ghost that learned how to smile." My reflection looked back older, wiser, unbreakable. Whatever Clara and her mother had planned, they had underestimated one thing. I wasn't the frightened woman they once despised. I was the woman who had survived them. And I was done playing the fool. The days that followed were strangely peaceful, almost tender. Clara floated through the house like a butterfly before a storm, pretty, restless, unaware of the gathering winds. Ethan was happier than ever, talking about wedding dates and future homes, blissfully blind to the darkness curling around him. I cooked, tended the garden, and smiled as if everything was normal. But beneath my calm, something cold and deliberate was taking shape. I had the photograph, the recording, and Rosa's report. But I needed one more thing, proof that couldn't be denied, something that would shatter the illusion completely when the time came. So I waited. I listened. I let Clara believe she was winning. Every word she spoke was a thread, and I was patient enough to weave her own noose from it. One afternoon, while she and Ethan were out, I took the photograph of Leonard and Veronica and placed it inside my dresser drawer. Seeing their faces together again no longer hurt, it clarified. This wasn't about heartbreak anymore, it was about justice. When they returned that evening, Clara complimented my stew, as if rehearsing kindness. "You're such a wonderful cook," she said, her voice dripping honey. "Ethan's lucky to have you." I smiled softly. "And you, dear?" "Oh," she laughed. "I'm even luckier." Her eyes glinted with something cruel beneath the charm. I nodded. "Yes, I suppose you are." That night I lay awake, listening to the rhythm of their footsteps above me. The air in the house felt heavy, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming. Tomorrow, I would make my move, but not yet. A single misstep could turn truth into rumor, justice into spite. Timing was everything, and I had learned patience from years of silence. I touched the edge of the photograph through the drawer and whispered, "One more lie, Clara. Just one, and then it's over." Outside, thunder murmured in the distance, faint but growing. The storm was on its way, and this time I would not seek shelter. I would walk straight into it. The morning the trap began to take shape, the sky was a deep, endless blue, the kind of color that makes people think nothing bad can happen under it. I smiled at the irony. Clara was on the veranda, painting her nails, while Ethan worked at his laptop in the study. I brought her a glass of lemonade, setting it gently on the table beside her. "You've been so kind to me these past weeks, Clara," I said softly, "and I've been thinking we should celebrate your engagement properly. Your parents have done so much for you. How about dinner in the city this weekend? My treat." She blinked, momentarily surprised, then smiled, tilting her head in that delicate, calculating way she had. "Dinner? In the city?" "Yes," I said, feigning shy excitement. "There's a restaurant I've heard of, very elegant. I'd love to invite all of you, to thank you for raising such a wonderful daughter." Her smile widened. "That's thoughtful of you, Marta. I'm sure my parents will adore that. They've been wanting to show you some real fine dining." The last words dripped with condescension, but I pretended not to notice. "Perfect," I said warmly. "I'll make the reservation." When Ethan entered a few minutes later, she was already chattering about dress choices and champagne lists. "Mom wants to go all out for us," she told him. "Can you believe that?" He laughed, kissing her temple. "That's my mother for you. She loves a good celebration." I smiled, but inside the gears were turning. That afternoon I made the call to a place I knew well. Le Méridien, an old restaurant in the heart of the city. I hadn't been there in over 15 years, not since I'd left behind the woman they used to call Mrs. Valencia. Back then, I'd held business dinners there, the staff greeting me with reverence. I still remembered the maitre d's face, Jacques, a man with perfect memory and impeccable manners. When I mentioned my name, his voice on the line lit up with recognition. "Madame Valencia, it has been too long." "Indeed," I said quietly. "I'd like to reserve a table for 6. And Jacques, no introductions until I ask. I'd prefer a surprise." "Of course, madame," he replied smoothly. When I hung up, I stood by the window, the late sunlight washing over my face. The game had gone on long enough. It was time for masks to fall, one by one, starting with hers. The night of the dinner, the city glittered like 1,000 lies dressed as stars. Clara and her parents arrived first, all perfume and arrogance, the kind of people who believed luxury was a language only they could speak. Ethan was radiant with pride, holding Clara's hand, while I followed behind in silence. I wore a simple black dress linen, not silk, and a small shawl embroidered with wildflowers. It was an old piece, handmade, the kind of thing they'd call quaint. When we entered Le Méridien, the chandeliers shimmered gold, and the air was thick with violin music and quiet wealth. "Oh my," Veronica murmured, glancing around approvingly. "I didn't expect you to know a place like this, Marta. It's quite sophisticated." "I like to surprise people," I said gently. Clara chuckled, her gaze sweeping over my clothes. "You certainly do. You could have told us the dress code was village chic." Her parents laughed, their voices like polite knives. I smiled, unbothered, and led them to our reserved table near the window. "Such a beautiful view," I said. "The same one I used to look at every week." "Oh," Edward asked, half interested. "You came here often?" "A long time ago," I replied, before I decided to slow down. The waiter appeared to take our order, and Clara smirked when I asked for sparkling water instead of wine. "How wholesome," she whispered, sipping her champagne. That was when Jacques approached. His silver hair gleamed under the soft lights, his posture as impeccable as ever. "Good evening," he said, bowing slightly. "It's an honor to have you back, madame." Clara smiled politely at him, then froze as he continued, his voice carrying warmth and reverence. "It has been many years, Mrs. Valencia. The staff still remembers your generosity. We are delighted to see you again." The table went silent. Veronica's fork slipped from her hand, clattering softly against the plate. Edward blinked. Ethan looked at me, confusion dawning in his eyes. But Clara's face drained of color. "Valencia?" she echoed faintly. I turned to her with a calm smile. "Yes, dear. You never asked what I did before the garden and the smoke and the wooden spoons. I suppose you thought I was just simple." The matron inclined his head. "Your usual table is prepared, madame. Shall I bring your preferred vintage?" I nodded once. "Please do." As Jacques walked away, I turned back to the table. "Now," I said softly, "shall we continue with dinner?" The silence that followed was worth every quiet humiliation I had ever endured. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the soft notes of the violin filled the air, delicate and mocking, like a soundtrack to disbelief. Clara stared at me as though she'd seen a ghost. Her parents exchanged nervous glances, their false poise cracking at the edges. Ethan sat in silence, his brow furrowed, torn between confusion and dawning realization. I let the pause stretch just long enough to make them squirm before I spoke. "I never meant to deceive you," I began, my voice calm, deliberate. "But sometimes silence teaches more than speeches ever could." I took a sip of my water and continued. "When my husband passed, I inherited his company shares, our properties, and several trusts. I retired early, invested wisely, and came back to the village to live quietly. It was refreshing to see who people became when they thought I was no one." I turned my gaze toward Clara's father, who was gripping his glass so tightly his knuckles whitened. "You run a small consulting firm, don't you, Edward? Funny, I believe one of your largest contracts was with Valencia Holdings 15 years ago." "My holdings." He blinked, stunned. That's impossible," he stammered. "Valencia Holdings was mine," I finished softly. "Founded and managed by me, after Leonard's passing. It's still operational under new management, but my name remains on every document. And yes," I added, turning to Clara, "I am the executor of Ethan's inheritance trust." Everything my husband built, our estate, our properties, our shares, passes through me until Ethan marries. Silence. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Her mother's face twisted between shock and the desperate smile of someone realizing too late that they'd misplayed their hand. I leaned forward, folding my hands gently on the table. You see, my dear, wealth can be hidden as easily as ignorance, but truth always finds its way to the surface. Ethan finally found his voice, soft and uncertain. Mom, you never said any of this. I smiled at him tenderly. Because it was never your burden to carry. You deserve to live without shadows. I shifted my eyes back to Clara. But she already knew, didn't she? Or rather, her mother did. Veronica flinched, her fork clattering. You recognize me, don't you? I asked quietly. From Leonard's firm. The Seaside Gala, 1995. Her silence was answer enough. You played your part well, Veronica, I said. And so has your daughter. But the performance ends here. Clara's eyes glistened with sudden tears, her lips trembled, and she reached for Ethan's hand across the table. Please, she whispered, her voice small, fragile. You're misunderstanding everything. Her mother touched her shoulder, whispering, Clara, don't. But Clara brushed her off, her mask cracking in real time. Yes, I lied, she said quickly, looking at Ethan with wide, watery eyes. But not for the reasons you think. I was scared, okay? Scared you'd see me as unworthy, that your mother would hate me for my past. I only wanted you to love me. Her voice shook, the perfect rhythm of a confession rehearsed 1,000 times. When my father's company failed, I lost everything. I've had to pretend my whole life just to be accepted. Maybe I said things I didn't mean, maybe I acted proud, but it was just insecurity. She pressed his hand harder. You've always been my safe place, Ethan. I never wanted your money, just your love. Her tears fell, then soft, deliberate, the kind that sparkle under candlelight. For a moment, Ethan faltered. His expression wavered between anger and pity. Clara, he began softly, but I spoke before he could. You really are your mother's daughter, I said quietly. Theatrics must run in the family. Her eyes snapped to me, the mask slipping further. You don't understand, she hissed. You've never struggled a day in your life, haven't I? I asked calmly. I've struggled for everything I own, every breath of respect I ever received. The difference between us, Clara, is that I earned mine, you steal yours through sympathy. Her face hardened, the tears drying instantly. You can believe whatever you want, she said bitterly. Ethan knows who I am. I turned to my son, whose hand had gone still in hers. Do you? I asked gently. Because I have a recording that might help you decide. The night she told someone over the phone that you were just a step toward her real goal. Clara froze, her knuckles whitening, Ethan's face drained of color. That's not true, she whispered, her voice breaking. You're twisting everything. No, I said, my tone sharp now. I'm revealing it. The silence that followed was absolute. Around us, the restaurant's music played on, soft and oblivious, while the world at our table finally began to crumble. The restaurant had fallen into that peculiar silence that comes when truth is about to shatter something fragile. Ethan's eyes darted between Clara and me, confusion clouding the tenderness that had always lived there. I reached into my handbag, pulled out the small recorder, and placed it on the white linen tablecloth between us. The soft clink of metal against glass made Clara flinch. You're bluffing, she said quickly, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. You wouldn't. I pressed play. For a moment, there was only static. Then Clara's own voice filled the air, clear and unshakable. He's too easy, really. He thinks I care about his little dreams, but he's just a step toward my real goal. The sound cut through the elegant murmur of the dining room like a blade. Conversations at nearby tables faltered. Once we get his inheritance, I'll finally get what I deserve, her recorded voice continued, smooth, confident, cruel. Ethan froze. His face drained of color, and I saw his world fracture in real time. Stop it! Clara hissed, lunging for the device, but I slid it out of reach. Enough! She shouted, eyes darting wildly between us. You don't understand someone manipulated that. You're framing me! Her words came too fast, too desperate. Ethan stared at her, his lips parting, but no sound came. I turned the volume down and let the device rest, still humming faintly with static. "You can deny it all you want," I said quietly, "but the truth has its own voice, and tonight, it's yours." Clara's tears came in floods now, no longer graceful but frantic. "Ethan, please, she hates me, she's wanted to ruin us from the beginning." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Clara," he whispered, his voice raw. "Tell me that wasn't you." She swallowed, looking down, the silence between them answer enough. "I didn't mean it like that," she murmured finally. "It was just talk." "I was angry." "Angry at what?" he asked softly. "At me." She looked at him, searching for the man who once adored her without question, but he was gone now, his gaze sharp, wounded, seeing her for the first time. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken louder than I ever could. For a long, unbearable minute, the table remained frozen, Ethan pale and shaking, Clara breathing in shallow gasps, her parents exchanging panicked glances. Then Edward cleared his throat, his businessman's instinct scrambling to regain control. "This has clearly been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice brittle with forced calm. "Let's not make a scene, Mrs. Valencia. You've embarrassed my daughter enough." I turned my gaze on him, slow and steady, the way one looks at a man who's already buried himself and doesn't yet know it. "Misunderstanding?" I repeated softly. "That's a generous word for deceit." Veronica leaned forward, her voice trembling with irritation. "You can't just accuse our daughter without evidence, you—" "I just played the evidence," I interrupted, my tone sharp as glass. "But if you'd prefer financial evidence, I have that too." I reached into my purse again and unfolded Rosa's report, sliding it across the table toward them. "Your debts, your bankrupt company, the 2 engagements your daughter ended once the families realized she had nothing but charm to offer. You've been circling wealthy men like wolves around a wounded deer." Veronica's mouth fell open. "How dare you? How dare you?" I cut in, my voice calm, cold, unyielding. "How dare you try to use my son the same way you once tried to use my husband?" Her face went still, the color draining as recognition flickered in her eyes. "Yes," I said softly. "I know about the seaside gala, about the money Leonard gave you before you disappeared. You didn't just send your daughter into Ethan's life by accident, Veronica. You sent her as your unfinished business." Edward stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You have no proof of that." "I have enough," I said, my voice quiet but lethal. "And I've made sure others have it too. I sent copies of everything to my attorney this morning. If you think you can intimidate me, try it. But you'll find that I've already played this game once, and won." He sat back down slowly, defeated. Clara wiped at her face, smearing her makeup into ghostly streaks. Ethan finally spoke, his voice raw. "You used me," he said. "Both of you." Clara reached for him, but he pulled away. The silence that followed was thick and merciless. Veronica finally stood, straightening her pearls, her voice trembling with pride she could no longer afford. "Come, Clara, we're leaving." Clara hesitated, her eyes red, her future collapsing quietly in front of her. I watched them go without a word. When the door shut behind them, Ethan exhaled shakily, the sound of a man whose illusion had just died. I reached across the table and took his hand gently. "You see, my son," I whispered, "sometimes lies collapse on their own. All you have to do is step aside and let them fall." After Clara and her parents stormed out, silence swallowed the room. The other diners turned back to their meals, pretending not to have witnessed the wreckage of another family's illusion. Only the clink of cutlery and the distant hum of violins remained. Ethan sat motionless, staring at the empty seat where Clara had been. His face was pale, his fingers trembling as if he were holding the weight of every lie at once. For a moment, I wanted to reach out, but I didn't. The truth needed room to settle. "I was so sure," he whispered finally. His voice cracked. "So damn sure she loved me." His hands covered his face, and the sound that escaped him wasn't just pain, it was disbelief, heartbreak, and shame twisted into one raw note. "You tried to warn me," he said through his fingers. "You saw it all, and I didn't want to see it. God, I defended her against you." I moved closer then, my hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You loved her," I said softly. "There's no shame in that, only in letting love blind you forever." He shook his head, tears streaking down his cheeks. "How could I not see it? She was so good at pretending so perfect. Because you saw her with your heart, not your eyes, I murmured. And that's not weakness, Ethan. That's humanity. He looked up at me then, his expression a mixture of sorrow and regret. You went through all this to protect me. To protect you, I repeated. Yes, and to remind myself that silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's surrender. He nodded, wiping his eyes roughly. I feel so stupid. Don't, I said. You're wiser now than you were an hour ago. That's what pain does, it teaches. He leaned against the back of his chair, exhaling shakily. I thought she was my future. She was a lesson, I said gently. The kind that saves you from a worse fate. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The waiter approached quietly, unsure whether to clear the table. I waved him away. Ethan's eyes met mine again, soft and searching. You're stronger than I ever realized, Mom. I smiled faintly. I had to be, to raise you, to lose what I did, and still find my way back. His hand found mine then, steady, warm, and grateful. I'm sorry, he whispered, for doubting you. You don't owe me an apology, I said, squeezing his hand. You owe yourself forgiveness. Outside, the night had turned cold, but inside, for the first time in years, I felt something break free. It wasn't joy. It was relief, the kind that comes only after truth has finally scorched the last of the lies away. The next morning, the house was unnaturally quiet. The air still carried the faint scent of Clara's perfume, expensive and artificial, lingering like a ghost that refused to leave. Her things were gone, every dress, every bottle of lotion, every trace of the woman who had fooled us both. Only a single pearl earring remained on the nightstand, a perfect symbol of her half-truths and broken promises. Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the gravel path where the taxi had driven away hours earlier. She didn't even look back, he said softly. Not once. She never would, I replied, pouring him coffee. People like her only look back when they've left something they value. And she didn't value you, Ethan. She valued what you could give her. He nodded slowly, his face pale but resolute. She said she'd make me regret this, he murmured, that she'd come back someday. I smiled faintly. Let her try. I faced worse storms than her threats. He looked at me then, really looked, as though seeing not just his mother but the woman behind all the masks, the survivor, the strategist, the fool who'd chosen her role wisely. I understand you now, he said. All those years you stayed quiet about your past. You weren't hiding. You were watching. Watching and learning, I said. Because the world never changes, Ethan, only the faces do. He took a deep breath. I don't know how to start over. You already have, I told him. You chose truth over illusion. That's how every new life begins. He managed a small, broken smile. You always make it sound easy. It's never easy, I said softly. But it's always worth it. Outside, the morning sun began to climb over the hills, washing the garden in gold. For the first time in weeks, the air felt clean, light, untouched by deceit. I stood by the doorway as Ethan gathered his coat, ready to return to the city. What will you do now? He asked. Live, I said simply, as I was meant to without pretending anymore. When he left, the gate clicked shut behind him, and silence returned. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the old wood, the life I'd built from ashes. Clara's laughter no longer echoed here. Only peace did bittersweet, yes, but mine. I looked out across the fields and whispered, let her hate me if she must. The story's over. And with that, I closed the door, not with sorrow but with quiet triumph. Weeks passed, and the storm that had torn through our lives began to settle into a strange, aching calm. The world outside carried on as if nothing had happened. Birds still sang in the mornings, the market still buzzed with gossip and laughter, but inside our little world, everything had changed. Ethan came back one Sunday afternoon, his car tires crunching softly over the gravel. When I opened the door, he stood there with a bouquet of wildflowers, crooked, imperfect, and beautiful in their sincerity. You used to put these in the kitchen window, he said, smiling faintly. I thought you might want some again. I took them from his hands, breathing in their simple scent. They're perfect, I said. Come in. We sat at the old wooden table, the one that had witnessed everything from his childhood laughter to our recent heartbreak. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Words, after all, had already done enough damage. Finally, he sighed. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that I saw her with my heart, not my eyes. I think I see what you meant now. I smiled gently. That's not a flaw, Ethan. It's a gift. But even gifts need guarding. Love should never blind you, it should help you see more clearly. He nodded, his eyes heavy but peaceful. I thought strength meant holding on. I didn't realize it also means letting go. It does, I said softly. And humility doesn't mean bowing your head to others. It means knowing when pride will destroy you faster than pain ever could. He looked at me, his gaze filled with something I hadn't seen in years, respect, not just affection. You're not the woman I thought you were, he said quietly. You're so much more. I chuckled lightly. That's what happens when people assume silence means ignorance. They never imagine silence can be a strategy. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the garden, pruning the roses together like we used to when he was a boy. The sky turned gold, then violet, and for the first time in a long while, we spoke of ordinary things: work, the harvest, the neighbor's new dog. Life had resumed its rhythm, slower but stronger. When he left that evening, he kissed my forehead and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." I watched him drive away down the familiar road, the dust curling behind him like memory itself. He didn't see me wipe away a tear, not of sadness, but of relief. The kind that comes when a wound finally closes. It's strange how peace feels when it finally comes, not loud or triumphant, but soft, almost fragile. The world doesn't applaud when you survive, it just keeps spinning, waiting for you to catch up. The house is quiet now. The garden hums with the sound of bees, the old clock ticks in the corner, and sometimes, when the light hits just right, I catch a reflection of myself in the window and barely recognize the woman staring back. She's older, yes, but steadier. And she's no longer pretending. I think about everything that's happened, the lies, the cruelty, the pain, and I don't feel anger anymore, only clarity. Pretending to be less wasn't weakness, it was revelation. People reveal who they are when they believe they're unobserved. Clara thought she saw a fool, but what she really saw was her own reflection, vain, hungry, and fragile beneath all that shine. She wasn't my first lesson in deceit, and she won't be the world's last. But she reminded me that true power doesn't need to announce itself. It waits, it endures, it listens. Ethan visits often now. He's quieter too, wiser in a way only heartbreak can teach. Sometimes we sit on the porch together without speaking, the air between us clean of everything false. He looks at me differently these days, not as the mother who raised him alone, but as the woman who taught him that dignity can wear humble clothes. Last week he asked, "Do you ever wish you'd fought back differently?" I smiled at the horizon and said, "No, I didn't need revenge. The truth was enough." And it was. Because revenge burns fast, but truth endures like fire beneath stone. It purifies, not destroys. I tend to my garden, I write in my journal, I breathe without bitterness. The past is a ghost I've made peace with, and the future no longer frightens me. Sometimes, when the sun sets low, I pour a glass of wine and whisper to the quiet house, "You were right to stay silent, Marta. You let them show themselves." And then I laugh softly because in the end, the greatest victory wasn't in proving them wrong. It was in finally remembering who I've always been. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.